Jan tells me that she said last week I was in the middle of nowhere, and I'm supposed to tell you where the middle of nowhere is. Well, it's in divine order. That's where it is. But I had the opportunity to go down to Paso Robles area in Central Coast, and a friend of mine owns a ranch down there, and it's beautiful, kind of way out in the countryside, like a retreat. So I had a chance to go down there and hang out. So before I get to be serious here, I haven't had a chance to share humor in a while, but our friend Lynn Avery sent this to me, and I just had to share some of these with you. So these are pictures of signs outside of churches in different parts of the country. This one was from a Baptist church. It said, "The fact that there's a highway to hell and only a stairway to heaven says a lot about anticipated traffic numbers." "God didn't create anything without a purpose, but mosquitoes come close." "Don't give up. Moses was once a basket case." "Adam and Eve, the first people to not read the Apple terms and conditions." "Jesus is coming, look busy." Now here's one that may apply today. It says, "Come hear our pastor. He's not very good, but he's quick." And let's see. "Noah was a brave man to sail in a wooden boat with 2 termites." Well, anyway, just for fun. Fun is good. Well, I had the opportunity to listen to Catherine's message from last week on the story of Jonah, and that was very inspirational to me, and I thought it might be fun to dig a little bit deeper into some of the points that she raised with us. And so the first thing that she said that I thought was really important is that Jonah is a human being just like each of us. A human being trained from birth to be imprisoned by emotions and limitations. So I'd like to just take a look at our psychodynamics that are involved in becoming spiritually realized. This is what I'm working on, and this is what we're all working on. So one thing I noticed as I went to the Bible and I reread the story myself is that time and time throughout this whole story, Jonah just can't bring himself to submit to divine will. He keeps trying to steer reality into the way he wants it to be. This he does, the Bible tells us, by fleeing from the presence of Jehovah, as if such a thing were possible. He boards a ship, which soon finds itself at sea in a perfect storm. And the crew knows better than Jonah that somehow he is the cause of this tempest, and they toss him overboard to appease the angry God. And what happens when he's tossed overboard? Jonah finds that, as the Bible tells us succinctly, Jehovah prepared a great fish to swallow him up. So now he finds himself in an impossible position. He is forced to abandon the illusion that he has the power to command reality. In his confinement and fear, he asks God for release. He says, "When my soul fainted within me, I remembered Jehovah." When my soul fainted, I remembered Jehovah, and I will sacrifice unto thee with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay that which I have vowed. Now, as I'm reading these words, the voice in my head goes, "Oh, now that you're stuck, you get it. You're only throwing yourself upon God's mercy because you have no other choice." Now, fortunately for Jonah, God is far more merciful and compassionate than my inner critic, and he accepts Jonah's contrition on his face and lets him off the hook. And the whale spit him up. But you got to really love Jonah because he is nothing if not consistent. Yes, after this harrowing experience, he obeys God's command finally to go to Nineveh and call out the people to repent of their wickedness. But when, to his great surprise, the king and his people agree to this without hesitation, he gets angry. Jonah gets angry. Again, things are not proceeding according to his personal belief system. He wants the Ninevians to suffer. Now, the last chapter of the story has Jonah continuing to argue with God, and God continuing to be amused and merciful. both to Jonah and to the people of Nineveh. So one of the central insights that Catherine shared with us regarding the story is that metaphysically, as I said, Jonah represents you and me. I don't know about you, but I often have Jonah days. Days when I find myself stuck like the main character of the story in the stubbornness of my error consciousness. Days when I seem to prefer suffering to liberation. So just a week ago, while I was on this lovely retreat time, I actually found myself deep in a storm of anxiety and fear, as deep as Jonah was in the belly of his great fish. I encountered a crisis. Life threw a curveball. And I found myself facing two unexpected, unpleasant tasks, things that I had to do but which seemed so difficult that I didn't even want to try. In my mind, facing these decisions, I was very much afraid that whatever I did, people were going to be angry with me and that I would lose face, and worse, I would lose people's trust, and even worse, people's affection. Have you ever struggled with having to do something you knew or thought you knew would disappoint people? That's what I was facing. And here's the great psychodynamic. As soon as I began contemplating possible outcomes of my decisions, the storm in my head and my heart grew. And I imagined even more awful things that could happen. And these thoughts generated real gut-clenching sensations of dread and fear. And then I found myself in a very familiar circle of frightening thoughts that caused anxiety in my body, which in turn gave rise to even more scary thoughts. I was truly imprisoned in the belly of the beast. Now, one of the first things I noticed as I was going through this experience is that, like Jonah, I was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because in a perverse way, I was taking pleasure in my suffering. So much so that I forgot my spiritual practice, at least initially. In my emotional state, I felt compelled to keep my focus on the conditions instead of turning it to God as I have been trained here to do. I couldn't find the wherewithal to ask God for help, to let go and let God. The feeling state I found myself in was of such magnitude that I felt hopelessly imprisoned in it. But the truth is, this was the good news, that my spiritual recovery did not entirely desert me. Like Jonah, even in my discomfort, God was with me. Although in my conscious mind, I believed myself to be stuck in a very painful place, my subconscious mind now came to my rescue. Even in my anxieties, I was somehow also aware that I was safe and secure from all alarms, that I could hang in there with myself until deeper truths, the love and security of God Almighty, presence themselves into my consciousness. Now, the first thing I had to do to get to where I wanted to go emotionally was to admit the truth of what I was experiencing and to discern what's really going on. Now, I've come to understand that any time I experience this state of anxiety, which, like I said, is a very old pattern, the conditions that seem to trigger it are usually not the real issue. The real issue is almost always a deep fear of separation, a fear of doing something that causes people to stop loving me, a fear of abandonment. So I saw it last week in my situation that I was afraid of displeasing people. That was the real issue. Because somehow displeasing people feels tantamount to being kicked off the island. This is a very old pattern reaching all the way back to childhood, when displeasing my parents or teachers resulted in being yelled at and punished. As a kid, I usually couldn't control my behavior, so it was bewildering why whatever I was doing brought such painful responses. Being yelled at and punished really hurt physically and emotionally. So like any normal human being, I developed a defense against this hurt. Well, developing a sense seems like a lawful response, especially for a little kid with no spiritual training, but it does not lead to healing. Defense does not lead to healing. No, instead it preserves the pain and a protective barrier which then allows it to show up again and again in later years as the same pattern of thoughts and feelings, the same energetic tone that the original experience had brought out. So whenever we feel something that reminds us of some childhood trauma, our subconscious mind presumes that we are about to experience the same yelling at or punishment that we really did get once upon a time. And this kicks our defenses into high gear. For me, this defense shows up like it did a week ago, as a cycle of anxiety and belief in terrible things about to happen. This is a central dilemma all human beings faced. This is a dilemma Jonah faced. Our brains are wired by our earliest experiences. And if those experiences included powerful emotional traumas, regardless of the source or the intentions of the people involved, then the wiring supports the defenses we created as a way to protect against ever experiencing those painful feelings again. But this neurological reality is the foundation of error consciousness. We humans develop emotionally years before we develop intellectually. And so our thought patterns evolve out of our emotional patterns. This is why changing our thoughts is so difficult and why it takes time, discipline, and compassion. All of our Unity teachings emphasize this. The story of Jonah explains the consequences of fleeing from God, of relying on the beliefs of error consciousness, relying on them to provide us an adequate foundation for an authentic and satisfying life. The story even reminds us that the solution is always in surrendering our personal determination to the omnipresent love and care of the divine. But the story of Jonah doesn't tell us how to do that. That's where our Unity and New Thought teachings come in. Thoughts held in mind, both the conscious and subconscious mind, produce after their kind. In other words, as we read in Proverbs, as a man thinketh in his heart, so he is. So as long as Jonah thought he could separate himself from God, he created the consequences of his life that reflected the pain of that separation. As long as I thought that I was stuck all by myself in my own storm of anxiety and fear and my own crisis, the power of that storm kept increasing. Now our teaching, as you've heard me say many times here, is summed up by Emmett Fox's The Golden Key. Take your eyes off the condition and put them on God. Now doing this when the going is tough takes commitment and discipline. I think that training our thoughts is like trying to break a wild horse. The first time we try to ride it, we are going to get thrown off. And we are going to get thrown off many times before the horse learns to submit and trust that we have its own good at heart. We have to keep getting back on and risk the bruises and disappointments in order to achieve the goal. Now, I've been working at spiritual realization for 20 years now. I admit, I have never submitted myself to as rigorous a focus on retraining my thinking as Myrtle Fillmore did in partnering with God to heal her TB. Or as Charles Fillmore did, as Gail reminded us in the meditation, and what he did after he saw this healing. Myrtle's self-control and total reliance on God to manifest her affirmations of health are an endless source of inspiration to me. And also, let's notice Myrtle was just like Jonah, a human being, born with the exact same capacities that we all have. And our New Thought teachings assert that Jonah, Myrtle, you, and I are also just like Jesus. Like Jesus, we are all humans born into a particular time and place in evolution, endowed with the 12 powers of mind, capable of getting out of our own way and letting the Christ of ourselves prevail in consciousness. And this is the good news. It doesn't matter how many times we fall, how far from God we let our focus drift, how bitterly we condemn ourselves for our faults, how bitterly we blame the world for all of our problems. We are always free to start anew. And I promise us, each time we get back on that horse, we are bringing with us all the work we have done before. Our commitment and spiritual practice are cumulative. They constitute a virtuous circle of power that is always with us, even when we forget this in our conscious minds. Now, I discovered this as I struggled with the anxiety storm I've been speaking about. Without being specifically conscious of deciding that, I began to reach out and ask for help in overcoming the power of the storm. I called a fellow spiritual practitioner every day and asked for assistance. And each person offered me something different. And the cumulative impact of their compassionate listening was indeed to help the God within come back into my conscious awareness and empower me to do what needed to be done. Now, there's a great lesson for me here, because as I said, my fear was that by making and communicating some tough decisions, I would displease people and lose their affection and esteem. And my normal reaction to this predicament in the past has been to sidestep this anticipated reaction by withdrawing into myself and procrastinating in the hope that the problem might just go away. And sometimes it does, but not this time. So what I actually did was to reach out and take the risk of seeking help. I took steps toward creating the very connection with others that I was fearing I was going to lose. And is anybody here surprised to learn, or anybody on Zoom surprised to learn, that everyone that I reached out to was supportive and collaborative with me spiritually? To paraphrase Myrtle, I am a child of God, and I inherit no separation, no deprivation of love, no exile or abandonment. So with the loving support of my friends and colleagues, I gathered the courage to face my fears and do what was mine to do. And I did it, and I communicated it to the people that needed to hear it. And again, you will not be surprised when I report to you that when I did this, absolutely none, zero of the things that I feared would happen actually happened. None of it happened the way that I feared. I received nothing but support and agreement with the decisions I had made. Nobody held any resentment because of what I had to do. So like Jonah, God spit me out of the great fish of my own making. I was released by divine compassion to not only deal with my problems in an adult manner, but to then reflect on what had happened with an eye to incorporating the lessons into my spiritual practice. So what this experience taught me is that my spiritual work, those 20 years that I've put in, has resulted in a significant change in my subconscious thoughts. Whereas before I started as a true student here in Unity, my subconscious mind was controlled by what we call error consciousness. Now, I found to my amazement that my subconscious mind is far more connected to the Christ mind than my conscious mind had appreciated. So I'd like to offer the following for our consideration. Number one, discipline in our spiritual practice does pay off. What we have to do to change our thinking is simple but not easy. And we do as much as we can, as often as possible, and trust that God is working with us every step of the way. The more we do, the greater the return. But every little bit matters. Number two, God never gives up on us. The divine is always present no matter what we say or do. As Catherine pointed out last week, God does not judge us. God merely and always loves us. As St. Paul tells us in that famous passage from 1 Corinthians, God's love is patient, kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no accounts of wrongs. We can always depend on God's love. Number three, God not only helps us through our inner resources that include the 12 powers of mind, but God also helps us through one another. We help one another. We stand by one another. We support one another. We are each the embodied conduit of God's love to ourselves and to the world. As the medieval German mystic Meister Eckhart reminds us, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. This is our connection to each other. This is why each of us is God in action when we help each other. In the story of Jonah, God demonstrates through his relationship not only with Jonah, but also with the people of Nineveh, his unshakable, unbreakable commitment to loving us unconditionally. God is with us no matter what we think. Now, this is how I came through my recent storm of anxiety and dread, and it's exactly how I'll get through the next one. And it's how all of us can thrive in a world that seems shaken not only by the storms of our personal problems and challenges, but also by global storms of disease and pandemics, of fires and heat, of political betrayals and weakness, of bitter hatreds and distrusts. It all starts with me. It all starts with you. So let us recommit today, right here, to keeping consciously practicing the presence of God. Let us commend ourselves for the great work we have already done in our lives and build upon that as we create our lives today anew. When I let go and let God, when I watch the thoughts that get in the way of that surrender and substitute a more powerful thought, I feel myself unalterably and delightfully included in the fellowship of the divine that is, after all, always the only thing happening in all of reality. We can get through the storms when we let go and let God. And even when the storms somehow feel all-consuming, we can remain patient with the storm, knowing that the divine is present in it, even if we can't, in the moment, bring ourselves to appreciate that. And we can always reach out and ask for help from anybody who understands what we're going through in life. And this creates, as I said, this powerful, wonderful fellowship with God that is always keeping us up, holding us up. And to celebrate that, I'd like us to conclude our time together by singing about this fellowship. Why the song's called "Oh, What a Fellowship," number 203. And shall we rise?